Massive army sequences and crowd scenes has always been something in visual effects that has gotten me excited. These massive crowds and fully CGI battle sequences was really made popular by Weta Digital 25 years ago now. They're so chaotic and crazy, and it's something that I've wanted to try, and finally I got the perfect opportunity. Sort of. So while Weta Digital did amazing work, especially for their time, they had over 1,000 employees and at least 6 months to work on these scenes. Whereas I am just a single person with not too much time on my hands. So I'm going to see what I can do with the free open source software Blender in about 24 hours. Compared to back then, the new and upcoming Weta Digital visual effects company, which has over 1,000 employees now. I think this is going to be pretty interesting. So for the first hour or so, I had to do some experiments to find a workflow that might actually be possible to do this in Blender. So I started by finding some height maps online, downloading those and using them as a displacement to a plane to create some mountains. These mountains I wanted to use to see if I could have instanced characters kind of traveling along the terrain and following the shape of the mountain. So I turned to geometry nodes, which are awesome, but I'm still very much not super great at, and I did some experimenting. I started by instancing a bunch of cubes onto a flat plane using a basic geometry node setting by distributing points on a plane and then putting instances on those points. I then used the raycast node and plugging that geometry info into the raycast node. Then just using a set position node, I was able to instance those points on the geometry. Then by animating the plane with all the cubes on it, it actually worked to move the cubes along the surface of this mountain terrain, which at this point was looking like it's going to work. And so this had me pretty excited, except cubes just weren't going to cut it, unfortunately, and I was going to need some better geometry. And this is where I spent the next few hours. So I wanted to create like an army of orcs, and I knew that somebody had to have created some orc models already out there. Because if I have to go through the process of modeling and texturing, it's going to take me a lot longer. So doing some scouring on Sketchfab, I found these two awesome Yorkai models available for free to download. The good news is they were already modeled and textured. The bad news was that they weren't set up for Blender at all, plus they didn't have any rig to them and they were just positioned in these poses. So I went to work in Blender, starting by taking this geometry and modeling it into a T-pose so I could add a rig to it. I then went through and recreated these materials within Blender using the textures that this file came with. This in total took me a good few hours, but it was worth it because these models were so sick looking, and because I'm sure some of you guys might want to use these orc or Yorkai models in your own scenes, I thought that hey, since this awesome Sketchfab user was offering them for free, I would also offer them for free over on Patreon, now with materials and a T-pose ready to go in Blender. So if you guys are interested in these models, I'll put a Patreon link in the description for you. But then I needed to rig them as well. So for this, I used the Mixamo rig because we'll be using that in a second with some motion capture. Spoiler, and this was actually really tricky because these models are so complex and detailed that there's a whole bunch of individual parts to them. And you can't just apply a rig to them with automatic weights because there's so many loose parts. So I had to go through manually and assign each part of the limbs of this character and the corresponding armor to assign them to the different bones in the rig so they worked somewhat naturally. I didn't have time to be too picky on this, but it still ended up taking me another hour or two for each character. But in the end, we had some rigged characters that were rendering really awesome looking in Blender. But now we needed some animation. And animation would typically be quite time consuming, but this is where it was made possible. Rukoku came in clutch and wanted to sponsor a video on CG Geek. I thought this would be the perfect project to put their Smart Suit Pro to work and start creating animations for an army. So thanks to Rukoku for sponsoring this video, and whipping out the Rukoku Smart Suit Pro 2, I was ready to start recording. Now we didn't have a treadmill, which might have made things a little bit easier, but instead I just wore socks on some slippery wood flooring and did my best Yorkai charge impressions. Capturing multiple takes was super easy with Rukoku Studio, plus I had these smart suit gloves, which in this project I didn't even need finger motion capture because we're doing some massive army flyovers. You're not going to notice finger movements, but did just use the motion capture gloves in a previous TikTok that I did with the Stormtrooper, and they work amazingly well. Trust me, animating fingers takes a lot of time, and so being able to capture them in real time with Rukoku's smart gloves was a lifesaver. Rukoku also offers the motion capture camera face rig, making it really easy to capture facial capture as well through Rukoku Studio with just your phone. All these goodies together makes creating a large variety of animations really quick and easy. And lucky for you guys, Rukoku currently has an indie bundle put out where you can get Rukoku's Motion Capture Smart Suit Pro, their motion gloves, and their camera facial rig, along with the Rukoku Studio, all for 40% off if you're an indie creator like myself and probably most of you guys. On top of that, you can save another 5% by using my referral link in the description and the discount code RKK_CG_Geek. definitely be links down there for Rikoku, and you can start creating a large variety of animations super quick yourself. Like, honestly, I was shocked how well this actually captured me falling on my face and then doing the worm. This Smart Suit Pro is kind of next level. But now that we had this motion capture data, it was time for me to start processing it. I'm not going to get into using Rikoku Studio too much, but they have some simple settings. You can really fine-tune your animation afterwards by adjusting the foot contact points so you don't have any sliding on your walk cycles and stuff. In this case, since I was doing looping animations, I was able to use just the treadmill feature because I didn't actually have a treadmill to run on, where it keeps your character locked in one place, and you can automatically create a looping animation with it. So then we're using Rikoku's add-on for Blender. It was easy to just take this BVH data and retarget it onto my rigged characters. And as you can see, this looked pretty creepy until I found the right setting. This was looking pretty awesome. Occasionally I might have to adjust some of the arm movements where I have it intersecting with the armor, for example. I just have to move some of the rotation axes a little bit in the graph editor. But aside from that, the data came out quite clean, and I was getting pretty excited on how it might work for this. So now it's time to combine my rigged characters with some motion capture data to my geometry node setup, where I could have them tracked to a mountain and literally following the terrain. And this was working surprisingly well, just by animating the plane that they're all on to give them some movement. What I would do to break up animation cycles is you could use the same motion capture data, just adjusting the keyframes to have them at a different time, so the loops won't line up exactly simultaneous, and it'll give some variation to your characters running. Then what I did is I randomly selected some of the faces of this plane and made it a separate object. So I basically had two armies intermixed. And then I animated these at different times, so the characters weren't all moving at the same pace to give more variation. Maybe we had some faster Urukai in this army, and then some of them that couldn't handle all that cardio and was kind of falling behind a little bit. This combined with a few different mountains placed in the background for the horizon of our battlefield. And then I kind of wanted to accessorize some of these Urukai. So of course, some of them had some shields and swords already, but I wanted to add some things to kind of break them up even more. So I made some variations where I have this Urukai, for example, holding a torch. I have this one holding a big spear. And for all these, I had to throw back on the motion capture suit and create some new data that would correspond with what the character is holding. But basically, the more animations and character variations that I threw into my geometry node setup, the better it was looking. And at this point, I have at least 12 hours put in on this project, and I need to start working on the rendering. So using a basic nighttime HDR from HDR Haven, that was my base lighting setup. Then what I started doing is downloading basic animated overlays that you might use in After Effects. I was adding them to a plane, and then in the shader settings, I was taking the highlights of these videos and plugging them into the emission output. So they were actually light sources. So then I went about distributing some of these throughout the battlefield, giving different areas of the field to be burning. This is going to be adding extra light to the scene, as well as just kind of breaking up the flatness of the army. And that was the only thing I had to do for the light setup. Then for the fog, I found that rendering volumetrics was going to be way too taxing, because when you have a lot of different mesh lights interacting with the volumes, and then that's just going to tank your render time. So instead of using volumetrics, what I started doing is again downloading all sorts of smoke overlays that can be found on the internet, and with a simple shader setup, using these to have some transparency and translucency, I was distributing them across my army to kind of add animated dynamic fog to the scene. Now I was super lazy with this and just basically sticking it everywhere I thought looked good, really quick and dirty. But the more smoke and mist and emissions that you threw at it, just the better it looked. So I just kept throwing more and more at this scene until we had like enough burning bushes and smoldering ground and smoke that it really started to add that depth to the scene. Now I wasn't sure how detailed to get with these Urukai animations. I did kind of want to do some fabric simulations, so I spent a few hours playing around with animating the fabric on their kilts, I guess you could call it, on these Urukai. And while this was working pretty okay, I found that when I distributed it as thousands of orcs across the scene, it really tanks Blender's real-time performance, which is something that I didn't want to lose, because being able to play back this animation in real time was good. So unfortunately, I had to skip out on the cloth simulations, but it didn't really matter, because from this large-scale scene, you wouldn't really be able to notice if the fabric is kind of kicking around on these orcs. It probably wasn't that important anyways. But what was important was giving this army some upgrades. I was realizing that it just kind of looked flat, and I thought I could give it a better sense of scale. So again, I turned to Sketchfab, and I found a free model of a freaking cave troll. This model is awesome, and kudos to the artist that created it. And with a few adjustments, it was rendering pretty awesome looking in Blender. So I put the Mixamo rig to this character troll as well, and then it was back to the motion capture suit, doing my best slow motion capture, because if you want to make something seem big, you have to move pretty slow. And so taking that motion capture data again, remapping it to my now rigged cave troll, it was looking pretty cool. And then I just sort of deleted the faces on my plane where I wanted these cave trolls to be sitting, so most of the orcs wouldn't really be in the vicinity. A few final touches that I did was I distributed some nature assets to the ground plane, some of the more dead assets that are included in my Nature Essentials asset pack. It's available on the Blender market for like 20 bucks if you guys want to check it out and support the channel, because every scene, even a dark, gloomy Orc Army scene, could use some nature. I also found some cool bush models from Sketchfab that I also distributed throughout the scene a bit here. And then for some of the final animation touches, I animated some floating embers. This is made by just creating a particle system, removing gravity from it, and then adding a bit of initial velocity to it and some Brownian motion to give it sort of that erratic particle movement. This combined with just a few simple planes with some emission materials on them ended up looking really cool once I added some camera motion and kind of flew through these particles that are kind of flying right by the camera then. Whenever you can put particles in the sky on your scenes, especially when you have an animated camera, looks really super dope. After throwing some clouds into the background and adding a few glows and compositing, here's time to render this army out, and I was definitely right about that 24 hours of time put in on this project. So doing an overnight render then, that 4K resolution, this is what I came up with. What do you guys think? How does this compare to a Weta Digital crowd simulation from 25 years ago? All made with Blender, which is free open source software that anyone, even your grandma, could download and start using today. And it was a ton of fun to just try my hand at it and see what I can come up with. And of course, I did include that motion capture data on a Urukai of me tripping and doing the worm. You guys will have to tell me if you find it in the comments below. If you did find it, you win a prize. But this project was a ton of fun, and again, thanks to Rikoku for making this project possible with their Smart Suit Pro 2. I also had way too much fun making a fool of myself, dancing around in a motion capture suit. It's highly therapeutic, actually. I recommend you trying it. This project was a blast, but also a lot of work, so I really appreciate it if you leave a comment on the video and get subscribed, because a lot of you guys aren't. And I'll see you actually really soon for another exciting video project. So until then, peace out!